President Donald Trump is heroically battling problems of his own making. That is perhaps the simplest way to sum up 5 months of chaotic US policy towards Iran. On February 28th, while US-Iranian nuclear talks were still underway, Trump launched a war that was supposed to be short and decisive. American air power would destroy Iran's nuclear program, force Tehran into unconditional surrender, and in the most optimistic scenario, even bring down the Islamic Republic. But over the following weeks, the objectives changed so quickly that they became difficult to follow. Eventually, the central mission of the US military became restoring freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, solving a problem that simply did not exist before the war began. In June, Trump believed he had found a way out. A 14-point memorandum signed on June 17th was supposed to halt the fighting, reopen Hormuz, and give both sides 60 days to negotiate a final agreement. Trump immediately declared a major victory and promised that the deal would bring peace to the entire region. Within weeks, however, the memorandum's key provisions were being violated on a regular basis, and Trump himself declared the agreement dead. The United States restored sanctions, resumed its blockade of Iranian ports, and restarted airstrikes. Yet after 3 more weeks of bombing, on Friday, June 24th, Trump once again suspended the attacks. Officially, the pause was intended to give peace negotiations another chance. Unofficially, however, reports suggest the decision was driven by assessments coming from the Pentagon. US military officials were said to have recommended halting further strikes, arguing that the current air campaign had reached the limits of its effectiveness. And so Trump now faces a dilemma. He can acknowledge failure and accept Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, or return to the kind of massing bombing campaign seen at the beginning of the war. But since that strategy has already failed once, there is no guarantee that repeating it will produce a different result. Iran, which had spent the previous weeks relentlessly resisting US pressure, attacking American military bases across the region as well as ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz, also suspended its attacks after Trump announced the halt in US airstrikes. But the situation remains far from stable. Yemen's Houthis have now entered the conflict as well. They announced a blockade of Saudi ports and attacked a Saudi refinery in Jizan on the Red Sea coast. Their entry into the war threatens to paralyze a second major choke point of global shipping after the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab al-Mandab Strait. So how did we get there? And where does this conflict go next? Let's dive in. Today's video is sponsored by Outskill. AI is evolving so quickly that the tools you are learning today may look completely different just a few months from now. That is why the most valuable skill isn't mastering a single app, it is understanding how to use AI effectively, no matter which models or tools come next. That is exactly what Outskill focuses on. More than 10 million people from over 160 countries have already joined their training programs, learning practical AI skills they can apply immediately in their work. I highly recommend their intensive weekend AI workshop, where you will learn how to use today's most important AI tools, build your own AI agents, automate repetitive tasks, and leverage AI for data analysis, presentations, image generation, and video creation. It is practical, hands-on training that you can start applying the moment the course is over. Sign up now and you will also get free bonuses, 50 secret cloud codes that turn it into a good tier tool, a full AI prompt library, and a personalized AI toolkit builder. You will find all the details and the registration link in the description below. To understand why the ceasefire lasted only a few weeks, we need to take a closer look at the map of the Strait of Hormuz. it was the dispute over the shipping lanes through the strait that became the immediate trigger for the resumption of hostilities. Point 5 of the June 17th memorandum required Iran to make every possible effort to ensure that for 60 days, commercial vessels could pass safely and free of charge between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. The same provision also recognized Iran's privileged position in the Strait of Hormuz and allowed Tehran to define the future framework for managing the strait, while stressing that this should be done in dialogue with Oman and in agreement with the Arab states. In hindsight, it is clear that the Americans never intended to honor that provision. Almost immediately after the memorandum entered into force, the Trump administration began insisting that the Strait of Hormuz was an international shipping route through which vessels should be able to pass freely without having to obtain Iranian permission, and that Tehran had no right to charge any transit fees even after the 60-day period had expired. The dispute had enormous practical consequences and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the memorandum. Because the main shipping lane through the Strait of Hormuz remains mined, commercial vessels could only use two corridors, an Iranian one or an Omani one. Transit through the Iranian corridor required coordination with the Gulf Strait Authority established in May, as well as compliance with instructions issued by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The second route runs farther south along the coast of Oman. It was established by Oman in coordination with the International Maritime Organization and the US Navy. Washington encouraged shipping companies and Gulf states to use this route in order to demonstrate that freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz could be restored without submitting to Tehran's demands. For Iran, this was unacceptable. Tehran's objective was never simply to restore shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but to impose a new legal regime on these waters, under which every vessel passing through Hormuz would have to obtain permission from the Islamic Republic before transiting. The first serious incident came as early as June 25th. The container ship Ever Lovely, traveling along the southern route near the Omani coast, was struck by an unidentified projectile. Though the Iranian authorities denied responsibility for the attack, they simultaneously issued a highly revealing statement. The safety of vessels operating outside routes designated by Tehran would not be guaranteed, and ship owners themselves would bear responsibility for any consequences. The Americans announced that Iran had violated the terms of the memorandum and responded with limited strikes against the Iranian coast. Over the following days, the situation escalated rapidly. Attacks on ships using the Omani corridor intensified. US airstrikes also increased in scale, and eventually Iran responded by shelling American bases across the region. Finally, on June 8th, Trump declared that the memorandum was no longer in force. He announced the reimposition of a naval blockade on Iranian ports, revoked the license allowing Iran to export oil, and ordered the resumption of the airstrike campaign against the Islamic Republic. The final twist in the entire saga came when Trump announced that the United States would become the, quote, guardian of the Strait of Hormuz, and in exchange for protecting shipping would charge ship owners a fee equal to 20% of the value of the cargo being transported. In other words, the US president first demanded that Iran abandon plans to impose transit fees in Hormuz, only to propose an even higher fee payable to the United States. Trump ultimately backed away from the idea, but the episode neatly illustrates just how complicated and absurd this conflict has become. The US military operations resumed on June 8th took the form of a limited air campaign. Washington's primary objective was to reduce Iran's ability to attack vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz. The main targets were therefore radar installations, coastal anti-ship missile batteries, drone storage facilities, command centers, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps units operating along the coast, as well as railway lines and bridges used to move weapons into southern Iran. According to reports in the US press, Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of CENTCOM, argued that while the strikes had indeed reduced Iran's ability to threaten shipping, the list of viable targets within the limited Hormuz campaign had been almost exhausted, and that continuing the operation in its current form made little strategic sense, given that Iran, despite the losses it had suffered, still showed no willingness to make concessions. Some within the Trump administration began pushing for an escalation of the air campaign, which in practice would have meant a return to the intensity of fighting seen at the beginning of the war. But General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, poured cold water on those ideas by pointing to dwindling stocks of interceptor missiles. The scale of the problem is illustrated by estimates from analysts at the Center of Strategic and International Studies, who say that since the war began, the United States has fired as many as 1,500 Patriot interceptors, leaving only around 1,000 in its stockpiles. The situation is not yet critical, but shortages could become extremely serious in the event of, for example, a war over Taiwan, where the fighting would likely be even more intense and demand for interceptor missiles correspondingly higher. The ammunition problem is also affecting the war already underway. There are growing indications that US air defense units are rationing interceptor missiles and choosing not to engage some Iranian attacks directed against lower value targets. America's difficulty in achieving a decisive victory over Iran stems primarily from the way Tehran prepared for this war. Ballistic missile launchers are dispersed across the country's vast territory. Some are housed in underground complexes, while others are mounted on mobile launchers that are far easier to conceal. Iran can therefore threaten shipping not only with coastal batteries, but also with drones and missiles launched hundreds of kilometers inland. One symbol of the current phase of the conflict has become the Khaybar-Shekan missile, which has achieved some successes in strikes against American targets across the region. The Khaybar-Shekan has a range of at least 1,450 kilometers and, unlike many other Iranian designs, does not require a lengthy launch procedure. It uses solid fuel and therefore does not need to be fueled before launch. This allows it to be fired quickly from a mobile launcher, making it extremely difficult to detect. The missile is even more dangerous because some variants are capable of maneuvering during the terminal phase of the flight. Iran combines Khaybar-Shekan missiles with cheap drones and older, less sophisticated rockets, allowing it to overwhelm US air defenses more effectively. One example of a successful attack involving the Khaybar-Shekan was the strike on Muwafaq Air Base in Jordan, where 3 American soldiers were killed. The economics of the war also work against the United States. Washington relies on highly precise weapons, but they are also extremely expensive. Iran, by contrast, uses simpler and much cheaper systems. It is estimated that since the beginning of the war, the United States has carried out around 20,000 strikes against targets inside Iran, while the conflict has already cost roughly $37.5 billion. Although the United States and Israel have killed the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, as well as a number of senior politicians and military commanders, they have still failed to break Iran's will to fight. The Iranians remain determined because they believe that despite their losses, the war is still unfolding broadly in their favor. They retain the ability to respond to American attacks, while their strategic position at the entrance to the Persian Gulf allows them to drive up the cost of US military pressure by threatening oil and gas supplies, the very foundations of the global economy. That strategic position allows Iran to hold the global economy by the throat despite having relatively limited means. Tehran does not need to stop every tanker trying to pass through Hormuz. It only needs to maintain a credible threat of further attacks, pushing up insurance costs and forcing shipping companies to withdraw. That in turn drives global oil and gas prices higher. In theory, therefore, the strait can remain open while still being too dangerous for insurers and ship owners to use normally. That is precisely why just a handful of attacks on vessels using the Omani route were enough to bring traffic along the corridor almost to a standstill. Kepler's data illustrates this well. After the fighting resumed on July 8th, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz fell by 70%, while 90% of the vessels that did make the crossing used the route designated by Iran. Tehran is betting that rising fuel prices, further American military casualties, and the growing risk of a global recession will eventually force Trump to make concessions and sign an agreement on Iran's terms. The Iranians believe that the closer the United States gets to the November midterm elections, the easier it will be to extract concessions from Trump. Perhaps they are right. But if Trump was willing to abandon the June memorandum so easily, why would he not do the same thing again? Iran, however, still has another card to play. On July 20th, Yemen's Houthis announced the start of a naval blockade of Saudi Arabia. They warned that vessels calling at Saudi ports or carrying cargo to or from them could be attacked anywhere. Although the blockade announced by the Houthis, at least in theory, applies only to Saudi Arabia rather than to the closure of the Bab al-Mandab Strait itself, that distinction matters far less to shipping companies and insurers. After the war in Gaza began, the Houthis launched attacks on commercial vessels linked to Israel in solidarity with Hamas. In practice, their campaign effectively closed Bab al-Mandab Strait between 2023 and 2025 and forced the world's largest shipping companies to avoid the Red Sea and take the much longer route around Africa. Today, the importance of Bab al-Mandab is even greater. After Hormuz was disrupted, Saudi Arabia began relying more heavily on the East-West pipeline, which carries oil from fields near the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Since April, more than 4.5 million barrels of oil and refined products per day have been exported through Yanbu on average. Roughly 70% of those shipments were destined for Asian markets. The pipeline therefore allows Saudi Arabia to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, but it does not solve the entire problem. Tankers sailing from Yanbu to China, India, Japan, or South Korea still have to pass through Bab al-Mandab directly alongside the Yemeni coast controlled by the Houthis. Under current conditions, that is effectively impossible. And the Houthis have shown that their threats are not empty. On July 23rd, they announced attacks on the tankers Ancelia and Laila. 2 days later, they struck Saudi oil infrastructure in Jizan and Yanbu. Saudi Arabia responded with airstrikes on the port of Hodeidah and weapons depots in northern Yemen. Both sides also began mobilizing forces along the front line. As a result, the ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, that was largely held since 2022, is now on the verge of a complete collapse. According to Kepler data, just 11 cargo vessels passed through Bab al-Mandab on July 26, the lowest number in many months. The strait has not been completely closed and some tankers are still willing to take the risk. Others, however, are turning north and taking the long route around Africa. That journey adds roughly 10,000 nautical miles and can take an additional 34 days. The extra transport cost alone is estimated at more than $5 million per voyage, on top of roughly $1 million in Suez Canal fees and higher insurance premiums. The Houthis' entry into the war therefore complicates Donald Trump's position even further. The Middle Eastern crisis now affects not one, but 2 critical straits through which, before the war, a combined 24 million barrels of oil passed every day. All this brings us to the question of what options President Trump actually has. There appear to be 3 main paths. The first is to continue the war of attrition. The United States can maintain its blockade of Iranian ports and sanctions, respond to further attacks with limited airstrikes, and wait for economic pressure to force Tehran into concessions. But this option carries a number of risks, the greatest of which is a global recession. In June, the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve fell to its lowest level since 1983. These levels are not yet critical, but they do limit Washington's ability to stabilize global oil prices. Prices that a war of attrition lasting for several more months would almost certainly drive significantly higher. The second option is a return to full-scale war with Iran. If such a decision were made, it would most likely be taken jointly with Israel. It is therefore hardly surprising that on July 28th, all eyes will be on the Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington and his meeting with Trump. From Israel's perspective, having stayed out of the current limited strikes on Iran, the preferred option would be precisely a return to full-scale war and another attempt to bring down the Islamic Republic. If renewed bombing once again failed to produce results, Trump could raise the stakes further and give the green light for limited ground operations. Washington is still discussing special forces raids and the seizure of Hark Island, home to Iran's most important oil export terminal. In theory, the United States has sufficient forces to capture the island, but it would then have to hold it under constant Iranian missile and drone attack. More importantly, Hark lies more than 600 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz, so occupying the island would not directly solve the shipping problem. Seizing part of the Iranian coastline along the strait, meanwhile, would require at least 100,000 troops, according to former CENTCOM commander General Joseph Votel. At present, the United States has only around 50,000 troops across the entire region. Most analysts, however, doubt that a return to full-scale war would force Tehran to make concessions. If anything, a major campaign would probably trigger an even stronger Iranian response, accelerate the depletion of US interceptor missiles, and expose the Gulf states to further attacks. It could also further reduce shipping through Bab al-Mandab and, in an extreme scenario, bring traffic through the strait to an effective halt. The third option is another negotiated agreement, brokered through Oman and other mediators. The current pause in attacks is intended to create space for such talks. One compromise under discussion would allow free navigation through the southern corridor without Iranian permission, while vessels using the northern route would require Tehran's approval. Transit itself would remain free of charge, but Iran would levy fees for services actually provided, such as environmental protection or maritime security. Another proposal would channel these payments into a joint fund administered with the participation of the International Maritime Organization. For Trump, even this agreement could be difficult to accept. The president would have to tolerate fees for specific services and recognize a limited, negotiated Iranian role in managing the northern corridor. But it is also the only option that would reopen Hormuz relatively quickly without further expanding the war. Such an agreement would also help stabilize the situation in the Bab al-Mandab Strait. Ultimately, Trump has to decide what matters more: Iran's unconditional surrender or the rapid restoration of shipping through Hormuz. After 5 months of war, there is little sign that both goals can be achieved at the same time. If reopening the strait before the November elections is the priority, Trump will have to accept an agreement, even if that means making concessions to Tehran. The president may not like it, but the most realistic path to ending the war now appears to be a deal that would leave the United States in a worse position than it was before the conflict began. And this is what happens when you start wars you are not prepared to fight.